Let's start our conversation with the fact that our president, Volodymyr Zelensky, has said that Ukraine may send a request for the arrest of North Korean leader Kim Jongun to the International Criminal Court. But is there any sense and any benefit in this request, let's say, if Kim Jong-un is not, in fact, leaving the country, at least? At the very least, it is necessary to check the reaction of other countries. North Korea is increasingly becoming a key part of Russia's war against Ukraine, which has been ongoing since 2014. Since 2022, Belarus has offered its territory but not its troops. In contrast, North Korea is directly supplying manpower. Therefore, the world needs to focus more on the emerging axis of evil formed by Russia, North Korea, and partly Iran. Iran may not fully support Russia due to its interests in opposing the West, but not to the extent of allying with Russia. Former Iranian President Ahmadinejad noted that in 1941, Iran was occupied by Britain and Russia, leading him to view them as essentially the same, requiring compensation for their historical wounds. We need to inform our partners that Russia and North Korea are growing closer, even though Russia, as a UN Security Council member, previously imposed sanctions on North Korea. This situation highlights a permanent member of the UN Security Council violating its own sanctions. Psychologically, we should promote the idea of an emerging axis of evil and emphasize that peace in the world depends on addressing this issue. If at least the leaders of North Korea and Russia, in the long run, and not even the president of Iran, but Rahbar, their Khamenei, will all be, let's say, either arrested or at least treated as criminals. І Росії, а в перспективі і навіть не президент Ірану, а Рахбар, їх Хаменеї, що вони всі будуть, скажімо так, або заарештовані, або принаймні буде відношення до них. Because so far, we see that even the fact that there is an international criminal court warrant against Putin does not mean that Russia is not on the blacklist, not even on the gray list. Why? Because some kind of deal with Russia is constantly taking place. And here, unfortunately, we again recall the quote by Boris Johnson, then the Prime Minister of Great Britain, that Europe needs to decide whether it is for money or for principles. Despite the fact that there are declarative principles, they still want to trade with countries that not only violate these principles, but undermine them. Absolutely. Our president noted that Vladimir Putin is testing the world's reaction to North Korean military activity in the Kursk region, and he believes that the response from our allies is currently zero. But can it, could it, and will it be more? These troops are being used under agreements between Russia and the DPRK on Russian territory for attacks on their countries, so there is no question of invading Ukraine. Yes, but we understand that one way or another, thanks to these Russian troops, or rather North Korean troops on Russian territory, Russia has the opportunity to release its troops and send them to the front in Ukraine. That is, this is albeit not direct, but still assistance in waging a full-scale war. And here it is worth mentioning that not only are these sanctions that Russia imposed on North Korea being violated, but also the intervention of the military itself, which threatens not only Ukraine in the future. That is, we need to model the situation. If North Korea provides its military to Russia, it is quite possible that North Korea will ask the Russian military to help it in its war. And here I can immediately point out against whom this war will be. Well, it is unlikely to be against China. It will be either against South Korea, the only country other than Russia and China with which North Korea has a direct border, or against Japan, which also constantly suffers from its neighborhood with North Korea. Just 2 days ago, another missile test took place, which, as far as we know, fell 300 kilometers from the territory of Japan.
That is, there are risks. And if our partners do not want to slowly watch this new alliance take shape, which in the future will want to send its troops to Europe, South Korea, and Japan, we still need to take some action. After all, this, let's say, inaction and attempts to postpone the need for some steps that we have seen, in particular with regard to the North Korean military in Russia, we remember how even Austin, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, was not sure whether the North Korean military was there or not, and then confirmed that yes, they were, but far from the front. In other words, arguments are constantly being made to justify the lack of response. By the way, statements are constantly being made that we cannot, as you said in the story's introduction, shoot down missiles. We cannot do anything like that, because it will lead to escalation. You know, I personally saw a video that a member of the former Romanian parliament showed me, but this is still a person who is in power. How Romanian border guards shoot at drones that attack Odessa region is simple. As he explained to me, we don't know where these drones will fall, on your territory or in Romania. So we shoot at them, and it turns out that unofficially, of course they don't talk about it, but they shoot. And the question is, why can't we also shoot at missiles? Because there are also risks here and waiting for these missiles to return to Ukraine. And what if they don't? We are modeling the situation, and there are already black jokes that Belarus is the most active among other countries in terms of shooting down drones flying to Ukraine, as it is not sending up aircraft to escort all these missiles and drones, but to at least shoot at them, because they also understand the risks from them. Unfortunately, we are suffering from indecision, primarily on the part of our partners, because they live in fear that nuclear weapons will be used there. You know, now everyone is discussing a book by Woodward, a man who is part of the White House, and he just wrote that a lot of these fears, these escalations, are based on the fact that they once misunderstood the report of Burns, the head of the CIA, when he said that there is a possibility that Russia could use nuclear weapons. And they immediately said, if there is, it means 50%. And 50% is a big number, although I'm not sure that 10% is. This reflects a complaint against American politicians who, despite clear intelligence about the war, added their own details and now fear nuclear escalation. However, the 5 or 6 failed tests with the armature suggest that Russia may not have the capabilities it claims.
Цієї ядерної ескалації. Хоча, як на мене, 5-6 невдалих випробувань Сармату – це якраз дуже гарне підкреслення того факту, що навряд чи у Росії є ті можливості, про які...
In Russia, they joke that these capabilities are more like cartoons than reality. Unfortunately, both the US and the EU are overly fearful of Russia's claims. This situation reminds me of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Kennedy made concessions based on Khrushchev's assertion that the Soviet Union had over 100 missiles targeting America, despite there only being 2 at the time. But unfortunately, the risks have been greatly exaggerated. And unfortunately, this exaggeration of risks in the United States and the European Union prevents, in my opinion, much more decisive action by our partners, both in terms of providing weapons to Ukraine and in shooting down missiles and drones that are flying at us. And yet they still think about the 50%. These discussions continue, and regarding the president's mention of a lack of reaction, the German Foreign Ministry has acknowledged the possibility of new sanctions against the DPRK if its troops engage in the war against Ukraine. However, this may not be effective, as North Korea has grown accustomed to sanctions and is not afraid of them. The full-scale war has shown that sanctions often serve as an excuse for the West to avoid military involvement and significant costs. Our analysis of Russia-Iran cooperation revealed that Russia is particularly interested in Iran's experience in circumventing sanctions.
Коли почалась, до речі, повномасштабна війна, ми аналізували співпрацю Росії і Ірану із Національного інституту стратегічних досліджень. І ми зрозуміли, що найцікавіше, що є для Росії в контексті Ірану і санкцій, це досвід Ірану по оминанню санкцій. Тобто, з однієї сторони, на папері санкції були.
That is, on the one hand, there were sanctions on paper, but in reality, they did not really exist.
На території України, що там є деталі з Ірландії, я пам'ятаю, знаходили в них.
And we can see that, as a matter of fact, in the Shaheen missiles that are shot down on the territory of Ukraine, there are parts from Iran, as I remember, found in them. I think that there are also parts from other Western countries in the missiles that have recently been flying over Ukraine, by the way. They had American parts in them from North Korea. So all of this means that the sanctions mechanism is rather, on paper, quite substantial. Due to inadequate export controls, sanctions against Russia and other countries are being circumvented. I expect the next sanctions package to implement the G7 finance ministers' decision, which first banned direct supply of goods to Russia. As Russia began purchasing through intermediaries, our partners imposed sanctions to prevent banned goods from being sold to other countries with the intent of reselling them to Russia. They simply added another chain where a country, roughly speaking, buys goods from the EU or the US and then sells them not to Russia but to country B, which in turn supplies them to Russia.
Продає його не Росії, а країні Б, а країна Б продає його Росії. Тобто, будь ласка, країна формально не продала цей товар Росії, а продала іншій країні, а та, що інша країна продала
So technically, the country did not sell this product to Russia, but sold it to another country that has already transferred it to Russia. This circumvents the sanctions, and now the idea is that any company that sells a sanctioned product to Russia, perhaps Iran or North Korea, has to ensure that this product does not end up in Russia or North Korea or Iran.
Чим це важливо? Тому що будь-яка компанія буде тричі думати перед тим, як взагалі-то продати цей товар країні, яка
This puts the responsibility directly on the companies that sell these goods. And this is important because any company will think twice before selling these goods to a country that could hypothetically redirect them to Russia. It is also necessary to study what re-export opportunities exist. We understand that many countries have now become a kind of gasket between the West and Russia. For example, the Maldives supplies microchips to Russia, even though they are not producers of them, which is an obvious re-export. Here, I believe that there will be a significant revision of global trade rules, which have long been overdue. The emphasis now will be on ensuring that these products do not enter Russia, in particular by banning supplies to countries that can resell these goods. Yes, it is difficult, and it causes losses to the producers of these products. But I repeat what Boris Johnson said. You need to decide whether you are for money or for principles. A difficult choice between money and principle that our friends and partners make every day. But another interesting statement is that of Lithuanian President Gitanas Nausėda, who believes that in response to the presence of North Korean troops in the Russian Federation, NATO should allow Ukraine to strike deep into Russian territory and increase military assistance. Currently, neither situation applies, and it's unclear if long-range strikes are possible, especially since the DPRK military has not been confirmed to be involved in the fighting in Ukraine. So far, this is all happening on the territory of the Russian Federation. Well, first of all, what I said earlier, that they are directly involved in the fighting. I don't have any absolute information yet. If it's confirmed that they are involved in actions within Russia and releasing Russian soldiers fighting in Ukraine, that would constitute participation in the war. The Kursk operation isn't aimed at capturing Kursk. However, a fighter there mentioned a significant Ukrainian-speaking population. This raises a question. While Russia claims to want to protect Russian-speaking people, what happens to the Ukrainian-speaking individuals facing hardship in Russia? Therefore, it is better to return to the borders that existed before the outbreak of a full-scale war in Ukraine and Russia, and in this regard, not to raise this issue because otherwise there will be constant wars. As for this idea of granting permission, I think it is long overdue, and this indecision of our partners, their unwillingness to take important, bold steps, has done us a lot of harm. I hope that after the U.S. elections on November 5th, our partners, particularly the U.S., will adopt a different approach to authorization. Biden could then become a historic figure, similar to Reagan, for weakening a major enemy, Russia, which is nearing collapse like the USSR. Meanwhile, it's crucial to strengthen ties with South Korea, as the North Korea-Russia alliance poses a threat to both Ukraine and South Korea.
Тому що зрозуміло, що союз Північної Кореї і Росії – це союз проти України і проти Південної Кореї. І тому, як на мене, логічно зараз нам...
So in my opinion, it is logical to work in this direction, and it can be a very good ally. We can also add Japan, and it will be, in my opinion, a super alliance. Japan, South Korea, Ukraine. I think that we can provide them with some knowledge from the experience of repelling aggression, and certainly Japan and South Korea can provide us with a lot. It's time to reconsider recognizing Japan's northern territories, known as the Kurils in Russia, as Japanese territory. We should focus our efforts on this Asian direction alongside cooperation with the US and EU, as it appears more promising. Given the past 2.5 years of full-scale war, despite some Baltic politicians feeling threatened and bolder, we should not only support Ukraine's deeper strikes into Russia, but also deepen relations with South Korea and Japan. By the way, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, as you know, had a phone conversation with Donald Trump yesterday, wishing him good luck in the upcoming elections. In fact, on Tuesday, if I'm not mistaken, it's the 5th. Is he counting on something? Or was it just a friendly gesture? Of course, Orban and many in the world are betting on Trump, because this model of behavior is closer to them. It is more inclined to authoritarianism. And in fact, this is the basis for the accusations of Trump by his rival Kamala Harris, that Trump has such a desire. While there is a desire for change, institutions in the U.S. remain strong, and I doubt they will allow ambitions to turn into significant actions. However, there are individuals inclined toward authoritarianism, like Orban and Fico, who may align more closely with Trump. Another question is, if we model that Trump becomes president, will he meet the desires of these politicians? Or, as is the good tradition, we will observe the three big lies that exist in the world: before the election, during the war, and after the hunt. It is after the elections, if he wins, that he can radically change his vision of politics, and those who support him very strongly now will be in a bit of a shock at how he will change. For a figure like Trump, this is, by the way, an absolutely common thing, because he is an unpredictable person. Therefore, I would not be surprised if he differs significantly from what he is saying now after his victory, and I emphasize that. However, we see that there is indeed a desire for a more authoritarian leadership in the United States, which is observed among representatives of more oriented elites, at least in Central Europe, where Hungary is present. On the one hand, we understand this desire, but on the other hand, we have to understand that democracy still exists in Hungary. As far as I know, for the first time in almost 20 years, 17 years to be exact, Orban's party is no longer the leading force in the country. There is an opposition party, TISA. I think we need to work more with them, our partners, and Ukraine. It's no secret that Magyar recently came to Kyiv right after the shelling of Ahmediyet and made an interesting speech near the Ahmediyet building, which I think could be the basis for cooperation. This is, of course, a slightly different story, but there's a growing circle of people here who want a more authoritarian model of world domination, and a circle of people who do not want authoritarianism. That is why, in my opinion, November 5th is a very important date, not only for the United States of America, but for the whole world, including Ukraine. Speaking about Hungary, Zelensky said that Kyiv and Budapest are currently working on a joint document that should address security issues and Ukraine's accession to the North Atlantic Alliance. What do you think this suggests, considering Ukraine and Hungary have differing views on Ukraine's alliance membership? Of course, we see a certain unwillingness to see Ukraine in the alliance. And Hungary and Slovakia, also spoke about this. But as I said earlier, democracy in the sense that the current elites in Hungary and Slovakia rather do not want to see Ukraine in NATO. As for the possible change of elites, in fact, why some politicians are so eager for an authoritarian model is to prevent this change, because democracy implies change. In the event of this change, the situation may change. So it is very important for us to cooperate with various political forces in Hungary and Slovakia in the context of constructive cooperation with them in the event of a change in Ukraine's vector, or immediately, as they say. Of course, we see certain fears that Ukraine in NATO means a conflict with Russia. But again, these fears exist, in my opinion, because the risks that Russia may pose are exaggerated. Here, in my opinion, Western partners should understand that if they are so afraid of Russia, they need to do one simple thing: help Ukraine defeat Russia. And then this monster will not be so scary. But because there are certain fears that someone somewhere wants cheap resources from Russia, this, unfortunately, has a negative impact on the support for Ukraine among these Central European countries. It's important to clarify that Russia may not be as threatening as perceived, and obtaining cheap resources could be problematic due to the ongoing war, which affects transportation safety in Ukraine. We should also consider alternative routes through Turkey and Bulgaria, as there are risks associated with the South Stream. The European Union, again, must understand that playing along with Russia on the issue of hydrocarbons continues this struggle, in which the EU is also part of, one way or another, because other EU countries are aware of the risks of this imperialist philosophy of Russia and the risks for themselves. First of all, for Poland as well. In general, we should also mention that our president, by the way, made quite a few statements yesterday and the day before yesterday in which he spoke, among other things, about providing certain types of weapons. Zelensky believes that the public release of Ukraine's request for missiles, initially in a classified part of the Victory Plan, highlights the Allies' indecision and efforts to delay assistance. We are talking about Tomahawk missiles. But was there any chance of getting such weapons at all if we could not be provided with 500-kilometer attacks? Here we are asking for 1,500-kilometer missiles. First of all, you can never have too many weapons in a war. And when we talk about Tomahawk, it's a hint that, you can't provide 500-kilometer range. So don't think that 500-kilometer range is, as they say, the ceiling of our desires. we also have tomahawks, and maybe something else, by the way. Because if we look at the victory plan that President Zelensky presented, there is a good point that Ukraine should not receive weapons from arms depots, that is old stocks, but receive the latest weapons that are currently being produced. It's no secret that the UK is currently working on laser drone destroying systems, which were planned for 2027, but promised to be delivered earlier. And so we don't just want it, we want it to get to Ukraine as soon as possible, as they say, to test it on our battlefield, because that will be the best test of this weapon. That's why Ukraine needs to keep saying that we need to win the war, because the question that should be asked is, do you want Ukraine to win or not? If you want Ukraine to win, the whole Western world will win with Ukraine. I'll quote the former head of Hungary's radio and television, killed by Soviet forces in 1956, "We are dying for ourselves and for Europe." This reflects Ukraine's situation today. In essence, we are fighting not only for ourselves, but also for the civilized world, which rejects Russia's methods. The behavior of UN Secretary General Guterres suggests he believes power has shifted away from the West, evident in his participation in BRICS rather than in the peace formula for Ukraine.
Вона, як на мене, генеральний секретар ООН, вона підтвердження того, що він, як то кажуть, думає, що зараз сила вже не у Заходу, а сила у інших країн.
He seems to believe that this force now dominates the world, justifying turning away from the West. We need to clarify that the West remains the leading collective force and deserves respect. To support this, we must take action by providing Ukraine with more advanced weapons and potentially allowing foreign military forces on our territory. Although this idea was initially brought up by Macron and then overlooked, it has resurfaced thanks to Hungarian Foreign Minister Szijjártó. He indicated ongoing discussions about maintaining military presence, suggesting a move beyond just talk to concrete actions. This follows discussions about shooting down drone missiles.
На порядок денний, тому що він сказав, що Угорщина не дасть своїх військових, але це прозвучало так, що зараз дискусії ведуться. Тобто з заяви Сіярта ми дізналися, що про це...
Still, Europe must understand that avoiding the next world war is possible, not if they try to avoid escalation, but if they intervene more actively and prevent a negative scenario from developing, as they did at the beginning of World War II, when they constantly sacrificed the territories of individual countries to appease the aggressor.
Буде не якщо вони будуть, скажімо так, прагнути ухилитися від ескалації, а буде, якщо вони більш активно втрутяться в питання і не...
So now, in my opinion, the era of the Chamberlains must end and the era of the Churchills must begin.
Початок Другої світової війни, коли постійно жертвували територіями окремих країн, саме для того, щоб умиротворити агресора. Тому зараз все ж таки епоха Чемберлінів, як на мене, пройшла, а треба, щоб була епоха Черчиллів.